This is Teresa Davis, your host of the Grief Mentor podcast. Welcome to Season 2, where together we will journey through the hardships that grief thrust upon us while holding on to the anchor that is trustworthy and true. Here you will find interviews and biblical truths that speak healing into the mind, body, and spirit of the brokenhearted. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome back to the show today, guys. This is your host, Teresa Davis, and the title of today's show is The Myths of Grief. Where do I go from here? Myth number 1, the pain will go away faster if I ignore it. Fact, trying to ignore your pain or keep it from surfacing will only worsen it in the long run. Myth number 2, it's important to, quote, be strong in the face of loss. Fact, feeling sad, afraid, or lonely is a normal reaction of loss. Crying doesn't mean you're weak. You don't need to protect your family or friends by putting on a brave front. Showing your true feelings helps you and your family and friends. How can your family and friends know how to help you if you hide your true self from them? Myth number 3, if you don't cry, you're not grieving your loss. Fact, crying is a normal response to sadness. However, it's not the only one. Those who don't cry may feel pain as deeply as others. They may simply have other ways of showing it. Myth number 4, grief only lasts about a year. Fact, there's no right or wrong time frame for grieving. How long it takes can differ from person to person based on the relationship and the circumstances of your loss. I believe that grief never ends, but intense grief can last 18 months to 2 years, and that's just early grief, and it can be longer based on your circumstances. As I said, I believe grief never ends because our love never ends. So because it never ends, guys, we must learn how to manage it. And that means learning to incorporate grief into our everyday life. And that does not happen without intention. I recently journaled this question. Think of a time that you faced an unsurmountable challenge. How did you overcome? What did you learn? And what was the main lesson? The circumstance that I used was the death of my son. And this was my response. Slowly, with community support, my faith, with lots of intention, reaching out of my comfort zone and relying on people with experience to walk beside me. God made us for intimacy, for this life that we're in. He didn't make us to isolate or even to experience death. Remember the story in the garden? When we grieve, our deepest groans declare that something is very wrong with this broken world. God created us with a gift of pain so that we can react when something goes wrong. It's a protective mechanism that alerts us that something isn't right. When we respond to our pain, it protects us from further damage. And pain is just not physical. It's also emotional. So I ask you, if you have a physically broken leg, would you ignore it? If so, I'd like to know how that's going for you. Left untreated, you could develop a very serious infection that could spread throughout your entire body and create what's called sepsis. You could even experience a fat embolism with a large bone that's broken that can travel to your heart, to your lungs, to your brain. Or if you survived your broken leg without treatment, you're probably going to be left with a permanent deformity. Funny thing about bones, if you don't get a bone properly set, it will attempt to repair itself. But once the bones start to regrow and mold itself around that fracture, you're more than likely going to be left with a permanent deformity. Grief is unseen pain that lives deep within our heart and soul. Grief that's ignored or masked by wearing the cloak of strong, holding back those deep emotions, will likely one day erupt like a fire hose. You know, the fire hose that ejects such a large amount of water at high velocities that it takes 2 to 3 men to hold it in place. By the way, grief and mourning are not the same thing. Grief is the experience of loss, the death of someone you love. It happened to you. Mourning is expressing grief from the inside out. Many grieve, few mourn. The unexpected brings everyone to a crossroad. What path will you choose? Will you manage your grief or let your grief manage you? How's your relationships with your living family and friends? Are you using substances to, quote, take the edge off? If you answered yes to that question, it will only lead to more of the same. How do you plan to honor your memories and make them part of your life? Do you desire to reach a place where you can celebrate your memories as the treasures they are? How's your thought life? Are they controlling your mood and your outlook on the life you still have to live? Do you have triggers that are interrupting your life? Do you have a plan going forward to manage those hard days, birthdays, heaven days, all the holidays? Where's God in your grief? Is he to blame for your circumstances? Grief empties us and leaves us vulnerable. You have a choice to make. What will you choose to do with this space that's been thrust upon you? Will you fill yourself up with bitterness, unforgiveness, anger, resentment? Hear me now. It's okay to visit those places, but it's not okay to stay there. The body keeps the score. You ever read that book? The decision you make now will affect your life 6 months from now, a year from now, 5 years from now, 20 years from now. And by the way, deciding to do nothing is still a choice. What will you do with this space that you didn't choose, but nevertheless is your life? While grieving the death of his wife, C.S. Lewis asked, "What do people mean when they say, 'I'm not afraid of God because I know he is good'? Have they never been to a dentist? The dentist's drill, while an instrument of intense pain, ultimately brings health. The drill of grief opens the door, guys, for you to learn things about yourself you never knew before. It brings questions to the surface that will help you discover answers that have the opportunity to change your life in ways you could have never imagined. You're at a crossroad. Which path will you choose? The familiar one that's full of bitterness and resentment and anger because your life didn't turn out like you expected? Or the other path that's unfamiliar and full of unknowns, but with intention, taking one step at a time, leads to a path of living with hope, celebrating the one you love and their memories as the treasures they are, and looking forward to living life that you still have on this earth. Sound impossible? What's impossible with man is possible with God. look 1827. Ready to take the next step? Visit the links found in the show notes. And that's all I have for you today, guys. So until next time, take care. The Roadmap for Grief is now live on my website. Through my personal journey of discovery, I have found 6 areas of grief that must be managed well going forward in a healthy grief journey. There are 6 modules with 3.5 hours of video content and an 83-page downloadable workbook. The key is learning to incorporate grief into your everyday life while honoring the one you love and looking forward to your future. These modules will aid you in discovering that there is a path forward with your loved one in it that leads to living your life after loss with hope. There's an early bird special for a limited time by using the coupon code GriefMentor, one word, no spaces, at checkout, and you'll receive $100 off either the self-guided track or live guided track. Individual tracks are available as well, and each have their own video and workbook. For a full description of each module, visit the link found in the show notes.